Hi, everyone. How are you? Prime time with Vinny B. I hope you're all doing well tonight, this Friday night. You ready for the weekend? Holidays coming. You're stressing probably about the list for Thanksgiving, but you won't stress right now, I promise, because if you've not lived on another planet, and even if you have, you probably heard of the Beatles because they were that popular. Well, we're going to look right now, modern Beatles, if they were around today, not at 83 years of age and old and crackling voices. Let's say the 40-year-old Beatles had been broken up 10, 12 years and they came back today. Would they be relative? Would they be relevant? Well, let's see why they were so big to begin with. Now, they are relevant today, and there are many reasons. The style that they created back in the 60s probably never go away. It's never going to go out of style. They may have looked like a passing fad when they first came out, and in fact, after their first song, "Love Me Do," they got mixed reviews. After they went on Ed Sullivan in February of '64, something changed. Billy Joel says that he decided to start a band the next day in his garage. Many young guys decided to start a band after seeing that. Now, their innovation throughout their career made fans tune into the music to see what they would be doing next because they unleashed constant music which resonated with the young girls. Then come 67, when they got into their artistic period of Sergeant Pepper, they probably knew they were going to lose a few of the teeny boppers who were getting older, 3 or 4 years older. When they came out in 63 or 64, a 16-year-old is not buying records probably the same as a 19 or 20-year-old who may be going to college or married at that age or whatever. And then come 68, when they grew beards and got big grimy, where they looked like they hadn't bathed, they probably lost a lot of the teeny boppers, but then they garnered a new crowd, the anti-establishment, hippies. So what makes a band that broke up half a century ago still relevant today? Decades of music have washed us since they last were together in 1970. Um, but innovative approaches to music are still relevant. We're always technologically advancing. They pioneered technology as musicians, and everyone takes a page or at least a couple of sentences out of their playbook with marketing their own careers, right? Now, through the Beatles' presence in the public eye, they're still relative and relevant. I keep on saying relative. Now, that's because Paul McCartney's still touring at 83, I believe he is. And their contribution to the Western world has always been their music. Okay. Combing through their different songs, their catalog, their eccentricity, backwards chords, mumbling. It's made them one of the most influential groups worldwide. And there are YouTube shows where you have the great artists. Bon Jovi, they've asked 500 artists, singers, songwriters, who they thought was better, McCartney or Lennon. I think Lennon won by a small bit, but that could also be because he's gone. Now, 40 years after Lennon's death and 20 years since the death of George Harrison, a little bit more, musicians are still trying to see what it was about the Beatles that grabbed the world because they want to do it. Thousands of pop groups have sprung up since the Beatles, right? During the British invasion. But the amount of ground that the Beatles covered in a short 7 years, Arguably, the Rolling Stones have been around for more than 60 years. Have they covered that ground? Now, why? Okay, well, first of all, they made the first music videos. Okay, in the early 80s, you timestamp it with VH1 and MTV. The music world's attention was focused on television instead of the radio. People had their television blasting now in the house. Uh, Pop starlets became sensations overnight because you saw what they look like. Their hit videos, right? Now, the TV channels didn't launch until 1981, but the Beatles were already on the cutting edge in the 60s, right? Um, they didn't have to wait to go out and promote their records when they decided not to tour anymore, the end of August 1966. They made promotional films for their material, and it turned into art forms as it branched out. Um, Now, they would play up their performance pieces. We Can Work It Out, Help, Strawberry Fields Forever, surrealistic imagery, which was much different than anything anyone has ever seen. Um, and looking at music, look, the commercial now looks like a movie would have, the quality of the film and all of that. But even when the film crews showed up at the studio, the Beatles had never play up their looks for the camera the way they did when they did a promotional film, Lady Madonna. The Beatles were about the music. They were always aware of the importance behind the camera and the audience's headphones. They were concerned with the music. Okay. Now, they were honest artistically. Most music fans can see through any corporate facade regarding their favorite artists. Okay. Some, whatever is hot, they jump on. The Beatles were the ones that made it hot. They really didn't follow anyone. They were the pioneers. It's easy to tell when someone's not being genuine, often sounding like they're reading from cue cards. It sounds canned. They ripped off this singer or that singer. The Beatles were never going along with that program. Every album they gave us pretty much was their true feelings of what the world was like to them through their eyes at that moment. As the Vietnam War raged on for most of their careers, the Beatles were always willing to speak their minds, more so toward the end of their careers. John Lennon advocating for worldwide peace, uh, McCartney going after the press for demonizing his drug use when he said it to a reporter and she put it on the front news, and he went after them. Like, you're pushing the drug use. I was being honest, and it's for you to shut up about it. Um, they mentally translated their live stage show. They had problems with the American press. They refused to play in a venue that would be segregated in the South, Jacksonville, and they got that done. So it's also easy to get that done when you were the Beatles and you were the hottest thing in the music business. But they turned out only a hint of what they were as a band when they broke up in 1970. Still young men. Uh, George Harrison emphasized the need for spirituality in life. John Lennon going after political corruption with help from Yoko Ono. Don't know if that would have ever happened without Yoko. I can't see his first wife, Cynthia Lennon, running around in a bag. Music was a good melody for most of these people, but the Beatles always were concerned with what was going on around them, and they started to talk about it when they hit their mid-20s. Got to remember, when they started, John Lennon was 22, 23. The others were 20, 21. So when they hit their mid-20s, they're not these teenagers anymore. They pioneered writing because their own material they wrote. When they first got the ball rolling, Lennon and McCartney were looking to be more than just superstars in the music business. As opposed to their idols, Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Lennon and McCartney modeled themselves after Goffin and King, the great songwriters that they thought were great. They were known for their brilliant melodies coming out of Tin Pan Alley, Goffin and King. It's one thing to be able to play and entertain people. It's another to write the songs and play your own songs. And they were one of the first bands to make that a standard, where that was just it. Although Buddy Holly and Chuck Berry were known for composing their own material, the Beatles are the first band to really make it expected for rock bands to write your own compositions. Um, you just expected it after the Beatles. And the Beatles had one up on rock and roll royalty, the King, by not expecting other people to write their stuff. Now, Lennon and McCartney never saw it as a chore either. You know, they celebrated, they'd have a week off and they'd come in with two songs during tours, in between tours, coming out with two albums a year. The wannabe rockers could still dip into playing cover songs, which they did in the beginning. But after the Beatles broke up, people had to write songs if they wanted to be half as successful as the Beatles were. So where you got away with it before the Beatles, when the Beatles broke up, you better write your own stuff now. You were looked at differently. They turned albums into art form. The Beatles originally were marketed as a singles collection. Most bands didn't put an album out for the album to be listened to. There was a lot of filler and one or two hit songs. Most bands' first few releases stand up as really good music, but then it wanes. They have some good singles, and then they have stuff that didn't make it into prime time. And they were slapped into random order on an album. As the band started loosening up from their touring schedule, the Beatles wanted to do something completely different, and they started with Rubber Soul. They began turning their albums into works of art, each song speaking to each other from back to front. That was never done before. And Rubber Soul is pretty much looked at as the first must-listen-to album that set the tone for albums being relevant now and not just all fluffer music and filler music. Not every album was draped in a narrative concept, but fans could hear the different way the bands were using the songs to complement each other, slowly fading in and out to make it smooth listening. It wasn't as choppy. By the time the band made it to Abbey Road, they'd begun perfecting albums with sequencing processes, leaving the final side of a record as a smorgasbord of different songs, sequences that blended in, the medley. And the Beatles are still pivotal in turning the album into a complete statement that a listener can enjoy from the first song to the last. And that wasn't the case before Rubber Soul, really. The lyrical growth, listen to the Beatles in 63 and look at the writing in 68, 69. Not every Beatles song was destined to win a Pulitzer Prize for lyrical complexity, believe me. Hey Bulldog, great tune, but some of their contemporaries like Bob Dylan made brilliant strides in the rock genre. The Beatles' early lyrics about puppy love started off pretty tame and pretty lame. But Lennon and McCartney were more worried about the tune's sound than the lyrics. They wanted the sound to be good because they feel that's what you're really listening to. When they began to workshop their tunes in the studio, every member began to see the words as an extension of themselves. Lennon a bit cynical. George became spiritual. Now, most of their songs, if you look at it, are tied back to love. John was one of the first to branch into a different topic, the political angle in Revolution, right? He wrote that song about the Vietnam War. Originally, he wanted it slow. George and Paul didn't want it slow. They wanted it to be a hit. So they made three versions. The first one was slow. The second one was the one that made the radio, and Revolution 9, which was his conceptual end of world type of music. Now, he created strange imagery, being for the benefit of Mr. Kite. And even when you go back to the love songs, they tried to break the mold of actually writing a hat in hand love song. Not a wistful sound. In My Life is not a wistful love song. A jilted lover at the end of Yesterday, not a wistful in the mid-60s. So they even changed how you wrote a love song. Now, out of all the main songwriters, George grew into the most advanced songwriter, taking with him the meaning of life. The others were on the fringe, Within You, Without You, before writing some of the most honest love songs ever created. Something widely considered one of the best love songs ever. Most artists might write their first song and finish the lyrics later. Every Beatle knew that the words that they would be singing had to be an extension of themselves to be taken seriously, and that's why they stood out. And they created the rock band model. The Beatles always had the reputation of being one of history's favorite rock bands. They just mothers loved them. There was something for everybody. Everyone thought Ringo was cute. If you were a wise ass, you liked John. The cutesy girls, Paul was always very popular because of the looks. And George was quiet and sullen. And if you were a guy that's a shy, quiet guy in high school, you could probably resonate with George. Now, talking about some of the biggest acts to come before the Beatles usually comes down to artists with a backing behind them. Buddy Holly and the Crickets, Elvis Presley, whoever was playing with him at the time. Out of all their heroes, the Beatles had four identical personalities. The cute one, McCartney, the quiet one, Harrison, the smart one, Lennon, the lovable one, dopey Ringo. So you saw the Beatles as a four-headed monster, as Mick Jagger called them. Now, even their producer, George Martin, thought their dynamic was strange in the early days, trying to narrow down who would be the lead singer before deciding to market them as a group rather than differentiate one from the other. Most bands tended to have a leader. The Beatles made rock and roll a democracy rather than a music monarchy. And that was really never done. Well, Dave Matthews Band, Dave Matthews is the singer. Mick is the singer, but arguably Keith Richards is probably more popular than Mick. Now, genre hopping. Most artists can only hope to find their voice in music and stick with it. It's hard enough to find a style of music you pull off effectively and become a star at. So artists usually find their niche and keep pumping out the same music. And that's why they all sound cookie cutter, right? The Beatles knew they had a loyal fan base that will always be waiting for them. So the Beatles, though repeating themselves at times, but it became boring. So they kept things interesting on every album. From 65 on, the Beatles dipped their toes into different genres. McCartney making ballads, the classical music, experimental rock, psychedelic period, hard rock, acid rock, first maybe Helter Skelter, the first heavy metal. They were always an eclectic mix at heart, covering soul tunes, Till There Was You from the Music Man, jazz flavored. Martha, My Dear, because he loved the music that he grew up with in his house in the 50s with his father, who was he was an amateur in the Jim Mack band. So their innovations and accidentally created some of them. The heavy metal Helter Skelter was probably accident. He had heard I Can Hear for Miles, or I Can See for Miles from The Who, and heard it was a real dirty, loud song, and McCartney wanted to do it dirtier and louder. The sounds of progressive music that artists like Genesis and Pink Floyd would start pulling from years after the Beatles. The Beatles always prided themselves on diversity throughout their career, and they would not let themselves get pigeonholed in one genre, and they didn't. They introduced new instruments. They used the studio as an instrument. It was almost like a five-man band. The studio was nameless, but the fifth musician. Very few bands stray from the typical lineup of instrumentalists. But you had bands that did, okay? Rock bands like to include a piano player on their songs. Nicky Hopkins, very big. He worked with Lennon. He's been with Rolling Stones for years, Nicky Hopkins, because of their lack of confidence in the other instruments that other artists can play better. Billy Preston coming in, obviously a better keyboardist than any of the Beatles. And in fact, during the Let It Be sessions, Lennon wanted Billy to become the fifth Beatle. and Paul didn't want another person in the band. But guys pigeonhole themselves into what they're great at, and if they feel they can't play as good as maybe a session musician, they'll bring one in. But they were willing to experiment, and they were working with different instruments that most fans would never have heard of. Now they used orchestras because George Martin orchestration. They bring orchestras in to play A Day in a Life, full orchestras, cellos, and all that. Now, outside of George Martin occasionally playing the piano or an organ part, he was a pretty good pianist. Um, Things started to change when George first bought the sitar. He exposed the Western world and the sounds of Indian music. Within You, Without You, Norwegian Wood. This bird has flown. John needed something in it, and he found the notes. He wasn't very accomplished at that point, but he found them. He's a good musician. Now, since they spent their days working away in the studio, each member could comb through different instruments. Handbells used on Penny Lane, early synthesizer on Abbey Road, the Mellotron, and that would go on to soundtrack future generations once the 80s kicked in. Look at all the drum machines and the Duran Duran organ pieces and loops and all that. So outside of different classical and non-classical, the Beatles even used instruments in different ways. Percussive slaps on the back of the guitar with I Will. Ringo slapping his knees to get the intimate feel of Words of Love. He played them on his knees, his hands. The kick bass wired a different way. John putting his voice through a Leslie speaker to get that Dalai Lama feel. They were more interested in exploring what they could do than what they were doing at some point. And then the innovative techniques, the production techniques, incredible. Through the mid '60s, it felt like the pressure of Beatlemania had finally swallowed the Beatles, and they stopped touring because of it. No one could hear them. No one could hear them, and they felt they were failing as musicians. They weren't getting better, and that was what they really wanted. So by the end of '66, the end of August, the massive screams had become too much for them. They quit the road, and they never toured again. They couldn't deliver music to people directly, so they used the studio as a playground. And with George Martin helping, different musical techniques, backwards guitar on Rain, the psychedelic movement came in, Strawberry Fields, the Sonic Fever, Dream Happening, and Tomorrow Never Knows. They just did it all. But not every sonic experiment went well. Revolution 9 still exists. In an alternate universe, I'm sure Paul would say, leave that one out. But they went out of the box. And generally speaking, they were successful. Look at A Day in a Life. But their songs, it's easy to chalk up the Beatles' success back then as lightning in a bottle. Kennedy was assassinated. The Beatles were refreshing. They came in at a time when America was reeling, and the youth of America had something to be happy about again. But after the band blew up in the early '60s, some of their greatest music could have easily come from being in the right place at the right time, but not for 7 years. They had some luck on their side, but they stuck around because they were skilled songwriters. Throughout their career, Lennon and McCartney's songwriting team blossomed into one of the greatest forces in music. They worked off each other, friendly competition, separate masterpieces, Eleanor Rigby, A Day in a Life, Strawberry Fields, McCartney the next day showed up at Penny Lane. They both tried to outdo each other for the A side. Artists blending commentary across the universe. Let It Be and Hey Jude, master of melody, McCartney, which undoubtedly was a better musician and a melodic force, much more than John Lennon. Now, while John Lennon was more of an honest writer, He was self-deprecating in a bit. He was honest. McCartney wrote about characters. Eleanor Rigby. John wrote about himself. Now, while George never had another creative partner to bounce off of, it was really more impressive with George than John and Paul. They had each other. George had no one to bounce anything off of. Here Comes the Sun, While My Guitar Gently Weeps. That's him. He had joked around once that you'd work on 8 hours of Paul's song, and then when he's done, he'd give you a half hour. He knew he made it when Paul got very excited about the song Something, and he knew he was onto something, no pun intended. So the Beatles wrote songs that the whole world wanted to sing, and they did. They certainly did. But the question is, would they be relevant today? Well, I look at it. Hey, everybody. I look at it, and I feel they would. Now, we have to look at their ages, okay? So I'm saying let's take the Beatles in 1980, okay? Beatles 1980, 38 to 40 years of age. You drop them in 2020. Would they still be accepted? Would they be good? Because music has changed, man. Now, so let's say that they had the Beatles career and then came back. Okay. And I always thought that was part of the reason that John didn't want to come back. John was very, very insecure. You wouldn't believe it, right? Being a Beatle, but he was. And music had changed. Look, in 1982 or 83, Islands in the Stream was number one. That was a crossover from a country song and the Billboard pop hit. It had really changed. But if they came back after 15-year hiatus, would they be good? The world has changed. People cherry pick now. They don't buy albums. You go to Apple Music, your favorite song. Would people start buying albums again? Because that's what they just did with the Beatles. Possibly. I believe McCartney would want to do a Tommy, a rock opera, which the closest they ever got to that was Sgt. Pepper. They'd probably be experimenting with new structures. I think they would be abandoning the standard verse chorus form. And I think they would have put multiple ideas in one song, more like A Day in a Life, combining two songs. I think they would have blurred the boundaries. I think they would have mixed rock with folk, psychedelia, although psychedelia is not big anymore. But they might have brought it back. Modern artists, Radiohead, Billie Eilish, followed in their footsteps. They crafted songs that defy labels and break traditional molds. So the Beatles probably would be the forerunners of that again. Okay? They were pioneers of the studio, and there's no reason to believe they wouldn't be now, especially with what you have now. Direct inject used to be you just put something in one of the tracks. Nowadays, I was in the recording studio with my friend. We did a song a few years ago, and he couldn't get a word. And instead of having to sing the whole line over or the whole verse over, just said the word. And I'll never forget, the word was love. I forget the whole lyric, but he ended it with love. So he heard it and he went, love, love. And they stuck love right like he did it continually, and he didn't. So you wouldn't have to do backward tape effects anymore. You wouldn't have to throw stuff in the air and tape them like Benefit of Mr. Kite, cutting 3-inch snippets and scotch tape them all together and whatever you got. Music production has changed, and I think they would have had a ball. Now, if pop culture now with social media is globalized, Okay. No band had ever achieved global stardom before the Beatles, but Ed Sullivan put them there. It was like a cultural earthquake, and it became the British invasion. So they were style icons. Would they change it now? Could they transcend borders? Look, administrations want this to be a globalized world, right? Would they help it from Tokyo to Rio? Would people be singing a new Beatles song? You have BTS, Latin artist Bad Bunny. They kind of hit a global path that the Beatles opened. Worldwide fan base connected through music. The Beatles would have really topped that, I think. I think they would have also caused individual artistry more within a collective sense. I think they would continue to be a band and work on solo projects. I think they'd also be an indie band. I don't think they'd need a major label to innovate. The Beatles started Apple Records, and I think they would have started another indie label. Um, the DIY ethic of home recording, self promotion, of experimentation. That they were all about that in the 60s. Why wouldn't they be about that now? Now, indie artists, they upload their tracks to SoundCloud. Major stars, Taylor Swift, reclaiming control of her music catalogs. Independence carries a strong echo of the Beatle legacy. So you would think the Beatles would be very into that. Now, also transforming their stuff, their experience. Can you imagine them playing in the Sphere in Las Vegas? A stadium concert, a live performance scale with what you have now with tape loops. Part of the reason the Beatles couldn't play live anymore, they couldn't replicate the sound. They couldn't do it. The three-part harmonies on Nowhere Man, they couldn't replicate it on stage. Now you could. The immersive live experience, the Beatles started that with 55,000 at Shea Stadium. No one had ever played to that before them. Now, modern stadium acts, Beyonce, U2, Coldplay, owe much of their DNA to the Beatles. The Beatles blueprint did that. Virtual concerts, live streams could be now broadcast on cable, right? So the Beatles story is more than history. It's a living influence that permeates every corner of modern music. So why wouldn't they be able to come back and set it again? I think they would have been able to. I think that, thank you, Joe. I think that Paul McCartney would have had a ball with John Lennon. I think that John Lennon, who loved media, John Lennon would have had a YouTube channel. John Lennon loved media, and he would have got a kick out of this. He would have done shorts, I'm sure. They would have had a large media concern. Look at the money they have. And now the thing is, thinking as 40 or 50-year-olds, would they be thinking like the 25-year-old? No, but the world had changed. I believe they would be certainly into causes. I think John Lennon would be very into causes. Um, I always thought if John were alive, they probably would have played Live Aid in 85. I would think the Beatles would have played Live Aid. I do. And at the very least, the 9/11 concert for 9/11, because you have to remember John Lennon was the thespian in New York, not Paul McCartney. This was Lennon's New York. Lennon would have took control of that, or at least been offered. And he wasn't going to tell Paul, don't come. Ringo would have been involved because Ringo follows Paul everywhere and he loves John. They would have had to get George to do it. And if it was a good enough thing, and the Beatles have been broken up 30 years by now, the wounds were healed. And yeah, I think he would have a one-off, probably would have done it. I don't think he would have wanted to get back with the Beatles, but I think for a good cause, look, he started the concert for Bangladesh. I don't know if there would have ever been concerts like that if George didn't start that. the benefit concerts. George started that. So I can imagine he'd be very into that. But I think that you just look at the Beatles, if they were around now, sure, music has changed, but look at the rigid society in the 1960s. People weren't free thinkers. In 1961, you were like this. Can I be excused from the table? By 1964, people were wearing Beatle haircuts and Beatle wigs. The Beatles went and changed a decade where there were pit stops and there was pushback. Why wouldn't they be able to do it now in a world that you could pretty much do anything you want? Think about it. Everything goes now. Back then, the Beatles charged through the door and they stampeded you, and then they had millions of young fans to follow them. You had no shot. Now, the door would be open for them because now you could be whoever you want. You can call yourself a breadbasket now. They don't care what you do now. So I think the Beatles would have been very relative now. It would have been amazing. Now, there was a rumor back in the 70s. Many of you probably don't know this. I don't think you do. And I'm going to lose someone send me $1 because I'm not going to get any advertising. Then I'm going to talk about why I wiped my channel and changed my station. There was a band, Klaatu. They were a Canadian band that started in the early 70s. John Woloschuk and Dee Long. They named themselves after the ambassador. Now, Klaatu was rumored to have been the Beatles. The Beatles playing under another name. They were progressive rock when progressive rock was starting out a bit. Psychedelic pop, pop rock, and space rock. Now, their combination was compared to the Beatles, the guitar rock of Queen, the electronica of Wendy Carlos, and the light sound of 10cc. Orchestrated ballads like the Moody Blues, ELO. Now, the rumor went around in 1977, an article published in the Providence Journal by this journalist, I forget his name, speculated that there was a release of a secretly reunited Beatles recording under a synonym. And it led to rumors, much like the Paul is dead rumor. There's always one idiot that starts these rumors. Now, it was fueled by a number of factors. The album was released by Capitol Records. That was the Beatles label in North America. The lack of artist and producer credits or photographs in the album package. There was nothing. Their avoidance of live performances. And they had a vocal style that resembled the Beatles. Now, in addition, in 1974, Ringo's album, Goodnight Vienna, had featured cover art with Starr appearing in place of the character Klaatu from the movie The Day the Earth Stood Still. Interesting. And Occupants of Interplanetary Craft became a minor hit for Klaatu in 77. Calling Occupants was covered by the Carpenters the same year and became a top 40 hit with them. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the song on for you. And let you hear it and tell me for yourself if you think it sounds like the Beatles. Let's see. Let's see here. Okay, I'm going to let you hear it. This was the song that was rumored to be the Beatles. Tell me what you think.
To telepath messages through the vast expanse of interplanetary craft, calling occupants of interplanetary most extraordinary craft. Calling occupants of interplanetary craft.
John Lennon with something on his voice.
Calling occupants of interplanetary craft. Calling occupants of interplanetary most extraordinary
Lennon with a voice.
You've been observing our Earth, and we'd like to make.
I think it was more people wishing that the Beatles were back together and having someone from the press or a music station saying, yeah, it's them. Oh, it must be them. And I believe people do that. So would the Beatles be relative today? Relevant. I keep on saying relative. Relative also, but relevant. I believe they would. I believe that they would have been mega media stars. They would have had their own streaming service because they had those minds. More importantly, they had the name Beatles. And like Michael Imperiali told me once, when you were on The Sopranos and you make a call to someone, they call you back. That Beatle name is strong. And people clamoring, because a lot of people don't like the music of today, to be able to go back in time to a place where you hung out, no bills. A lot of people would have jumped on that train. I would have been the first on there. So, yes, the Beatles would. Now, why did I change my channel name to Prime Time with Vinny B from Off the Record with Vinny B? Why did I wipe the channel? Yes, DJ, absolutely. Because I felt like it. Sometimes we have to reinvent ourselves. Still making the music shorts, but there will be more shows like this. And then if you see the thumbnail for later tonight, that will be my general live show where we'll talk about everything. But there will be a lot of theme directed shows, and this was the first one. So welcome in, everybody. Same Vinny, kind of same channel. Hopefully you'll tune in tonight and we could talk and ad-lib it. I'll see you guys later. Thanks for always being there for me.